We we had a fuller panel, but due to some travel related complications, we have a less full uh, program. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the people that couldn't be here physically to sort of come up on Skype, so they can still participate. The idea is that the final product of this workshop, we will edit some kind of a special issue or a book. We can talk about that. I know that some of you have different institutional pressures for the format or the medium of the publication, but uh, I think we're open to any kind of opportunity that you guys also might think of. So to sort of talk a little bit about the general sort of question that we have today is trying to understand how do different irregular migration pressures get sort of translated into border security practices and migration management practices. What are different logics? What are different points of attention? What are different points of tension in these areas? And what are different ways of studying these spaces? So, in your interventions, we have known your works for a very long time. So we're quite excited to hear your sort of empirical takes or your findings. But what 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 would be great is to sort of understand that connection between migration management and border security and how they play out. Like obviously, sort of you all have different ways of getting at this topic, so you don't all have to speak to this. But it would be great if you can highlight something to that question. And uh, I think hopefully we can have sort of we're a very small group, so we can have a very open question and answer period where people can ask questions, and hopefully you'll be responding in the same jest of openness in your answers. Uh, the panels are going to be recorded. Uh, I think for the larger project on borders and globalization, which has an online course component. Obviously, you can opt in or opt out of that. You will be given an option,
But not the discussions.
but not the discussions. Discussions will not be recorded.
Just a straightforward presentation.
But for some reason, for ethics purposes, for your own research ethics boards purposes, if you don't or if you can't be recorded, then please inform us because you will be given a waiver. You can choose to sign in or uh, sign out of that particular procedure. Now let me allow Emmanuel to give.
Migration and border things should be studied together, basically. There are lots of scholars who study borders, don't study migration. Lots of people who study migration don't study borders. And I think that the EU crisis, at least that's the hypothesis I put forward in the grant when I applied, is that the EU is at the forefront of a major transformation because whether we like it or not, the number of people who are going to migrate in the next 10 years is greater than any numbers before. And that's only because population rises. It's still about 3.5% of the world population, but we're talking about, you know, very large numbers of people. And so the EU, in its own geopolitical context, and I'll show you some of the data that I reflected upon when I was writing the Jean Monnet Network. Basically, in my mind, is confronted with something that it didn't expect. It was not forecasted. It was not in policymakers' mind. And certainly also it was completely, coming from the wrong side, I guess, of the Mediterranean Sea. And so this for me is really interesting as a policy issue. It's a really interesting one, and it's also something that we could look into carefully and comparatively. Because if the EU is faced with this major change, then we should study it, but we should also see what other states are doing. Hence the Japanese case and the Canadian case. And hence also the focus on within Schengen and the periphery of Schengen. So these are the four, if you want, angles that I have. I'm going to go, so what I should add to this is that the Jean Monnet Network is a specific grant that allows us, in the Borders and Globalization Research Program, which I've been leading for now 4 years, 4 years in April, so 3.5 years, almost 4 years. where we basically look at the transformation of bordering policies and border policies globally. We have right now small teams in 15 countries, including India and China. 15 countries, mostly in Western Europe and North America. We have obviously Mexico, we have the US, we have 3 teams in the US and in Canada. In Canada, there are 10 people who work on this that are my co-applicants. And so that's a very large research program that looks at the evolution and transformation of bordering processes. And we have 2 fundamental hypotheses. One is that the idea of the territorial trap, the idea that states, you know, basically use boundary lines and align their policies with boundary lines, is under very serious stress. And now we have a lot of evidence that it is the case, but also that the new policies and the new way to think about bordering policies includes controlling the movement of objects and people from very far away by completely new ways, completely new types of policies. And so when I applied for the Jean Monnet Network grant, my goal was to basically expand, because I thought that the focus on the EU was not enough in the Borders and Globalization Research Program. And I thought that the European case study, you know, what was happening in 2015, 16, and since then, but 14, 15, 16, was really unique to the European context, but would probably have very serious spillovers. And were able to allow us to study 2 types of policies quite well, obviously Schengen and Dublin. You know, the idea that you look at, you know, movement, free movements within the boundaries, and you look at free or not free movement across the boundaries. And you look at movement, and so you have to look at basically migration issues, but also you can look at trade. But in this grant, I focused on migration because I think it's more relevant to the rest of the borders of globalization. And so that gives you the background, and that's basically what, you know, I'm intending to lead all the way. Just so everybody knows, we started in Strasbourg looking at Schengen. Now we're doing the periphery, neighborhood policies, and, you know, the borders of Europe. Then we're going to go to Japan and then Canada. And then in April 2019, we have a major conference where we'll bring everybody back. So in San Diego, all of you should come with your final papers and possibly, I hope, because it's in the grant, 3 books, right? 3 books or 3 special issues. Well, that's really up to, I know with younger scholars it's very important to do articles, so we may all go for special issues. But the idea is that then we can, at San Diego, it's a very large conference. It'll be a shoulder of the association, annual meeting of the Association of Borderland Studies. There will be at least 250 scholars at that conference. They all specialize in border studies. And I think it's a nice way to show how important and how understudied in a way. It's very studied in Europe, but not in the rest of the world. And it's not studied comparatively. So how understudied in a way the EU policies are outside of Europe. And I think that's really, really, really important to be aware that, you know, the rest of the world has similar issues and doesn't know how the EU, because the media basically informs the average scholar, and then the media will say all kind of things that we know are completely approximate, to be polite and to be very Canadian, and we need to go beyond. So that's the idea. So I'm going to run you very quickly through the data that just to show you that it was very partial. So the 4 questions that I had in mind when I started with this idea was that, you know, there were geopolitical causes for the increased migration, and we probably didn't understand them well. That the EU was criticized, you know, in 2015 for being way too slow in reacting. And I was thinking, I don't think they're too slow, but that's just an hypothesis, is that I think that any government confronted with this, and since then I gave a talk in front of, for instance, the military. I had 55 officers, 2 generals in the room, and I asked them, I said, okay, if you've got, you know, movement with people who are at the border of Blaine, which is the county, you know, South County where I live, would you be able to actually deal with let's say, 3 or 4 groups of people who speak 3 or 4 different languages, and then would you have the capacity to deal with 3 months down the road? And people were shaking their heads. They know they can't. They can't even do it in Spanish properly. They would not have the staffing to do it. So this puts all of this in. And then, looking at the transformation, in other words, looking at how the EU reacted, but also maybe being critical and looking carefully at, value systems that are being implemented with EU policies and the changes, which I know there is a spectrum of views on this, and I think it's really important that we assess it. And then, the idea that at the time, I'm just being honest here, I started thinking on these things, quite some time ago. So, at the time, a lot of the media was talking about the end of Schengen. The Globe and Mail had an article on this in Canada, New York Times, and so on. So, just very quickly, huge increase in migration. So, we're talking 2 million since 2015. A fundamental change from west to east in terms of the migration movements inside the EU. So the states that traditionally had all the infrastructures basically didn't use them as much as the states that were east and that were also new member states and also the poorest. I'm not trying to make excuses, but I say that's the context. And then the diversity also in movement. So when we look at all these people, there is obviously, the basically limits to the database, limits to the information available, limits to the kind of diplomatic relations that the EU and member states have with all these people. So what I find really interesting about Dublin is that, the peripheral states become responsible. They've always been responsible for this. And very early, the EU knew, the Commission was aware because of Parliament's work, that there were inequity of treatment, not only of asylum seekers, but also of states, because capacity is really important. So that's the public policy side in me that basically says, well, we've got a problem here, because if you think you can put a lot of pressure on small states that are also, have the average GPA way below the average EU and so on and so forth, then you make things very, very complex, right? And then the EU reacts, and so I think it's quite interesting when we look at the data, is that suddenly there is a lot of money available, and I think this is quite interesting, is that the EU actually puts on the table quite a lot of money, and we should, I think, as social scientists, have a critical analysis of this. We need to understand, if there is a strengthening, basically, if the policy decisions are the same as the ones that were before, or if there is a fundamental change in the way these policies are understood. So I'll illustrate this very briefly. Schengen is a really interesting case. We already had the panel on this. And we know the European Court of Justice has a restrictive understanding of Schengen today. So the right, the freedom to move and settle anywhere, is actually much less free than we all assume, Europeans would assume. Right? This is one of the things that the lawyers at the Strasbourg workshop told us, is that Schengen is about the free movements within the EU, but actually that understanding has become more and more prescriptive and less open. The understanding of Schengen's rules basically restricts. You have all kind of conditions that the court actually allows member states to implement. So I think it's really interesting to look at that for Schengen, but I think for movement and migration, it's also interesting to look at how it was done. So, ideas, for instance, camps in Libya, camps in Turkey, and so on and so forth. Things that basically have been quite criticized, and I want to look at. So I'll share the different things that I have here, and my colleagues, the co-leads here, have already seen this. But one of the things that is really important to me is understanding if what we're observing in the EU is part of a bigger picture. In other words, is it also happening in Japan and in Canada that actually we don't care so much about the boundary lines, and that we have policies that are basically being negotiated worldwide, such as pre-clearance policies. I'll illustrate this very quickly. Canada, 10 years ago, had 4 or 5 custom officers in the rest of the world that basically implemented some form of pre-clearance, very, very big. Today we're at 60. They seal containers, and they can also basically implement in different states, right? Very specific policies that basically prevent people from reaching Canada, but also allow people from moving much more easily between wherever these agreements are into the country. So we've pushed the boundary line, and we've pushed the crossing of the border very, very far away. And I think this is, if it's an international movement, if it's something that we find both in the EU as a general policy, if we find this in Japan, if I find this and confirm this in Canada as well, I think it's really interesting because it means that the way we understand migration, movement, and the way we understand boundary merges, if it's correct. And if it merges, it means both areas of studies have to be rethought thoroughly. And that is basically the frame for our workshop. So that's all. If you have questions or comments, that's